Back to the daily grind, and shout out to the full-time patrons. Make sure to hit subscribe if you're new and hit thumbs up if you're not a baby back bagel biting bitch boy, cause you know what time it is. It's full time.
MMA.
And it's time for the Bellator 200. Mirko Cro Cop versus Roy Nelson. Breakdown and predictions brought to you by your boy Full-Time MMA. This event is going to be held this coming up Friday, I believe, actually on May 25th. It's going to be on tape delay. It's going to be in England, so I'm not sure the exact time we're going to get to watch the fights. But whenever we do get to watch the fights, these are going to be my predictions for the fights and also how I came to these predictions, which is pretty much just the breakdown of the fights. This is one of Bellator's most stacked cards of the year for sure. All 5 of these fights, I believe even Anastasia Yankova's fighting on the prelims, you know. So all 5 of these fights are great. Can't wait for all 5 of them. Well, Aaron Chalmers is kind of like, you know, it's like CM Punk being, it's like Bellator's CM Punk. He's like CM Punk being on the UFC 225 pay-per-view over like Curtis Blades or Alice Rovereem. Yeah, he probably doesn't deserve the spot over like Anastasia Yankova, but he's a very popular figure. He's the first fight of the night, so if you don't know who Aaron Chalmers is, let me break it down to you. I don't really know who he is, but I think he's a pretty big figure over in England. He's a TV star over there. He's on like their version of the Jersey Shore. I believe it's called the Geordie Shore, but he's a certified can crusher. Aaron Chalmers is 3-0 as a professional, and all 3 of the guys he fought, 2 of them it was their first pro fight, which isn't too bad because it was his first pro fights as well, right? He's only 3-0, so but he hasn't fought anybody very high level, but he's still early in his career, so you can kind of expect that, especially being a bigger star coming over to MMA. It's, you know, probably what the UFC can't do this because they don't have a lot of guys they can just sign in their UFC debut to fight CM Punk, or they probably would have. Mickey Gall, I mean, they tried to give CM Punk, but, you know, they did the best they probably could, but the UFC is still pretty stacked as far as deep with talent. So even Mickey Gall's a certified killer. Meanwhile, Aaron Chalmers, you can line him up with some guys that are not Mickey Gall, get him up to 3-0, which is where he's at now. But now he's going to be fighting Ash Griffiths, who is the most experienced opponent he's faced to date. But Ash Griffiths is 4-5. He's got 9 pro fights, which is triple the amount of fights combined Aaron Chalmers' recent opponents have had. Before this, Aaron Chalmers' most experienced opponent had 2 fights. So Ash Griffiths does have 9 fights, but he's coming this fight on a 3-fight losing streak. Also, Ash Griffiths has been finished in all 3 of those fights in the first round. Meanwhile, Aaron Chalmers has finished all of his fights in the first round. So I'm smelling a first round finish here for Aaron Chalmers, and I'm assuming he's like, you know, their version of the Situation. That's what I'm imagining from Jersey Shore, like, you know, Paulie D or somebody getting in the octagon. That's what this is right here. So it's going to be fun. Interesting to see how he talks on the mic. Is he going to be like a star type personality, talk trash? Interesting. I'm curious to see how that plays out and to see how the fight plays out. But I'm picking Aaron Chalmers to get the W. Moving next to Linton Vassell versus Phil Davis. Linton Vassell has 22 pro fights, 18-4. Phil Davis has 24 pro fights at 18-6. So Phil Davis is a little more experienced, but Phil Davis, as far as matchup wise, probably going to be a better matchup, I feel like, for Phil Davis. He's a dominant wrestler who had a successful stint in the UFC where he went 9-3 with wins over Tim Boach, Brian Stann, Alexander Gustafsson, Lyoto Machida, and Glover Teixeira before coming over to Bellator and going 5-1, only losing a split decision to the current light heavyweight champion Ryan Bader. So Phil Davis is definitely no joke. But he's going to be facing Linton Vassell, who's actually on home territory here. So he's, you know, the English fighter in this fight, but still, Linton Vassell, he hasn't been fighting guys on the level of Phil Davis, who's been fighting high-level guys his entire career. Also, they have some mutual opponents in Bellator. Both of these guys have fought Ryan Bader. Both of these guys have fought Liam McGeary, Francis Carmont, and Emmanuel Newton. And in all of those mutual fights, Phil Davis has arguably done better in every single one. Phil Davis lost a split decision to Bader. Linton Vassell was finished by Bader. Phil Davis actually beat Emmanuel Newton, who Linton Vassell, I believe, has a loss to. So I feel like Phil Davis is probably going to be the he's the higher level fighter in this fight. He's literally fought Brian Stann in his UFC debut and went on to have a successful UFC stint, and then have been finding success in Bellator as well, only losing a split decision to Ryan Bader. So Phil Davis is the real deal, and I think he's going to show that in this fight on enemy territory against Linton Vassell. With that being said, moving to the next fight of the night, my favorite, I can't wait for this fight. Michael Venom Page versus David Rickles. Michael Venom Page is like the Fruitio's version of Anderson Silva. He's Bellator's Anderson Silva back in the early days when there was a lot more casual fans. This was when I was a casual fan back in the day, when Anderson Silva was in his prime, making highlight reels, knocking dudes out with those crazy knockouts, you know, getting out of the way and coming back and knocking you out. That's what Michael Page is doing in Bellator. When I first found out about Michael Page, it was like Santa Claus, you know. I was like, oh my God, who is this fighter Bellator has over here looking like Anderson Silva, who I was a huge fan of. And, you know, he's doing all these, he's dancing in the octagon, knocking dudes out. Who is this dude? I literally looked up all of Michael Page's fights. I watched them all. They're all fun. I even looked up some of his kickboxing fights or karate fights, whatever his background was. I was even watching those fights, which all of that was entertaining and fun. But if you're a hardcore fan, when you start to look at his opponents and stuff like that, you realize Michael Page might not necessarily have fought any like high-level grapplers, and you have to wonder like what would happen, you know, against a guy like Rory McDonald. Would Michael Page get folded like a lawn chair, kind of like Chael Sonnen versus Anderson Silva? Anderson Silva, that's the thing, you know, to the casual eye, he looked great. Fucking no one can beat him, right? But whenever you put him against someone like Anderson Silva, a very high-level wrestler, it's a bad matchup for him. His flashy striking isn't going to help him when he's on his back getting folded, you know, by a wrestler. And so we saw Anderson Silva had to pull off a last-second triangle choke versus Chael Sonnen. Would Michael Page be able to pull off a last-second triangle choke versus Rory McDonald, you know? Who knows? But in the meantime, as long as he can fight strikers or smaller grapplers, which might be the case in this fight, David Rickles isn't necessarily a wrestler, but he is going to be coming up from lightweight. So I think this is a pretty good matchup for Michael Page. He's not facing some Division I, Division II Olympic wrestler or anything like that in David Rickles, who I'm a huge fan of just because I was born and raised in Kansas, and he's from Kansas. So David Rickles, you know, he's like Team 316 and shit. Like, so I'm rooting for him because he's kind of like the homer, right? So I'm just rooting for him because he's from where I'm from. But as far as the matchup is concerned, it doesn't look good for David Rickles because David Rickles is coming up from 155 pounds. So even if David Rickles were to have a wrestling heavy game plan to try and, you know, take advantage of Michael Page's weakness, it's going to be harder to keep the natural welterweight down because he's going to have a little bit of a size disadvantage. So, and if the fight stays standing, I think Michael Venom Page for sure wins that exchange. He's, you know, he grew up in a family of martial artists, had a very successful kickboxing background, Michael Page did. So he was a kickboxer, and also in between his MMA fights, he's dabbled in just boxing. Michael Page's striking is devastating, and it's something, you know, definitely to watch out for. Anybody's got to watch out for Michael Venom Page's striking. He might be one of the best welterweight strikers, pure strikers on the planet. So with that being said, David Rickles is going to have to try and find a way to take Michael Page down and keep him down, or maybe earn like a lucky knockout or something like that, catch him in a submission if he can. But I see Michael Page winning this fight in front of his home crowd for sure. This is Bellator 200, huge Bellator card. There was talks of Michael Venom Page versus Paul Daly, which would have been absolutely insane for this card. Little politics, Paul Daly, and, you know, back and forth with Michael Page. Fight wasn't able to happen. So I'm actually happy my boy David Rickles gets this opportunity. It's a huge opportunity to fight Michael Page at home on Bellator 200. David Rickles is tied for the most wins in Bellator history right now. I believe he has, how much does he have? Like 17? I don't know that stat off the top of my head, but I do know David Rickles broke a record or tied a record with his last win over Adam Piccolotti when he recently fought him at a recent Bellator card in the past. So with that being said, I got Michael Venom Page winning the fight. Next, we're going to the co-main event of the evening, which should be the main event. You got Gegard the GOAT, one of the pound-for-pound best fighters on the planet. Not just best middleweights, he's definitely one of the best middleweights, if not the best middleweight on the planet. but he's also one of the best pound-for-pound fighters on the planet, as Gegard Mousasi is fucking 43-6. This will be Gegard Mousasi's 50th pro fight. So I'm expecting Gegard, and he's only 32 years old. I'm expecting Gegard Mousasi to come in here and make a statement against the Bellator middleweight champion, Rafael Carvalho. I think he's going to make a statement with like an early finish. I think he's going to go for maybe an early TKO, I think Gegard Mousasi is going to come here and go for the finish, even if it's not early. I think he wants to make a statement in this fight and remind everybody he's one of the best middleweights in the world. And show everyone, put some fucking respect on Gegard's name, because after his last performance, Gegard Mousasi got a little bit of slack, like, oh, how do people even consider him one of the GOATs or one of the best pound for pound? He almost lost to Alexander Shlemenko. Alexander Shlemenko, for one, is no fucking slouch. He's got like pretty 50 pro fights himself. On top of, Gegard Mousasi fought that fucking fight with one eye for over half of the fight. Alexander Shlemenko still wasn't able to finish Gegard Mousasi, and Gegard Mousasi still won 2 of the rounds, if not 3, with one eye. So say what you want about that performance, but before Gegard Mousasi fought that fight versus Shlemenko, he came over to Bellator on a 5-fight winning streak, 5-fight KO TKO streak over Thiago Santos, Vitor Belfort, Uriah Hall, Chris Weidman. Fucking Chris Weidman. Did you guys see what Chris Weidman did to Kelvin Gastelum, who's likely about to be fighting for the title? Yeah, the All-American wrestler Chris Weidman. Gegard Mousasi beat that guy. Gegard Mousasi's got a win over Jacare in the past. Oh, by the way, Gegard Mousasi has literally a fucking win over Mark Hunt. Heavyweight Mark Hunt in the past. He's fought Fedor, Gary Goodrich. Gegard Mousasi is like a fucking legend of the sport. He's very underrated. He doesn't get the clout or the respect he probably deserves. His name's not big. I don't know if it's because his home country isn't that big of an MMA market, but Gegard Mousasi deserves a lot more respect from the MMA community, in my opinion, because if you look at his fucking resume, it is a murderer's row for the last fucking 10 to 11 years, if not longer, fighting at multiple weight classes, heavyweight, light heavyweight, middleweight, and even now at 32 years old, he's beaten the best of the best, as you could expect, with 50 pro fights at 32 years old. He's got a win over Chris Weidman, who's one of the best middleweights in the world. Chris Weidman's style is great against almost everybody. We've seen Chris Weidman lose 1 or 2 fights, maybe 3, but still, beating Chris Weidman's very impressive. He just ragdolled Kelvin Gastelum essentially after eating a couple shots in that first round. He just turned it into a wrestling match, submitted Kelvin Gastelum. Kelvin Gastelum about to be fighting for the title against Robert Whittaker. I mean, Robert Whittaker versus Chris Weidman's a fight I'd like to see. Chris Weidman, he might be able to do that to Robert Whittaker just because of his style matchup. So for Gegard Mousasi to come over to Bellator on a 5-fight winning streak, 5-fight KO TKO streak, he avenged his lone loss to Uriah Hall in the UFC. It wasn't his only loss in the UFC, but that was one of his only losses in the UFC and his most recent loss in the UFC. But he avenged that. That was a fluky knockout. Uriah Hall threw a spinning back kick that caught Gegard Mousasi as he went for a takedown or ducked down. But Gegard Mousasi is clearly the better fighter. He showed that in the rematch. So Gegard Mousasi, man, I'm expecting him to come in here, get a finish, and remind everybody he is not only the Bellator middleweight champion after this fight, but one of the best pound-for-pound fighters on the planet. And then we can start having a serious discussion on Gegard Mousasi is arguably the best middleweight in the world after he beats Rafael Carvalho, because he'll be on a 7-fight winning streak with wins over Weidman, and also if you compare him to Robert Whittaker, he's very talented. It'd be hard to see. It sucks because we can't fucking have that fight. Gegard Mousasi versus Robert Whittaker, we won't know who's the best middleweight in the world. We literally won't know. All you can do is say Robert Whittaker because of UFC. But Gegard Mousasi didn't leave the UFC because he was a scrub or on a losing streak, or because the UFC didn't want him. This was one of the best middleweights in the UFC. Top 5 ranked guys, beat Chris Weidman, but he went to Bellator because contract issues or whatever. So it's not like the UFC just wanted to let him go because he was on a 3-fight losing streak, or he was some 40-year-old dude the UFC didn't want anymore. Gegard Mousasi is one of the most experienced middleweights in the world, and he's only 32. So for Bellator to have him leaving the UFC on a 5-fight winning streak, if he can come in here and become the champion, now you can talk about Gegard Mousasi possibly being the best middleweight in the world, and Bellator having the best middleweight in the world, arguably, and the best welterweight in the world with Rory McDonald, who's got a win over the current UFC welterweight champion Tyron Woodley. So I think Gegard Mousasi is about to come in here, make a statement over Rafael Carvalho, who's a lot less experienced. Rafael Carvalho is 15-1 as a pro. Very impressive. He's on a 15-fight winning streak since losing his pro debut, Rafael Carvalho. But he's coming off of 2 wins over Melvin Manhoef and 1 win over, I believe, Alessio Sakara is his name. But the guys that Rafael Carvalho have been fighting are not the guys Gegard Mousasi has been fighting his fucking whole life, essentially. I mean, Gegard Mousasi was fighting the Mark Hunts and the Fedors and the OSPs of the world before the UFC, fighting high-level guys at heavier weight classes, and came to the UFC. His last 5 fights just versus the Vitor Belforts, Thiago Santos, Uriah Hall, Chris Weidman. Those guys are probably higher level than some of the guys Rafael Carvalho has been fighting. So I got to give this to the more experienced Gegard Mousasi in his 50th professional fight, and I think it's going to be a statement win. But Rafael Carvalho is a pretty lethal striker. Of course, he could catch Gegard Mousasi, but Gegard Mousasi's pretty experienced. It's going to be pretty hard to catch him unless he makes a mistake, which could happen. And even if it's not a mistake, you know, this is MMA. Maybe you throw a fluky spinning back kick and Gegard Mousasi just so happens to be ducking at that time and it connects, even, you know, or maybe Gegard Mousasi's dominating the fight via grappling and gets caught in a submission. We've seen it happen, but I'm just saying Gegard Mousasi should win this fight. It's Gegard Mousasi's fight to lose. I'll put it that way. Now, moving to the main event of the evening, a heavyweight fight. It might be an alternate fight for the heavyweight Grand Prix. I mean, but Roy Nelson was already knocked out of the heavyweight Grand Prix. But we have just a heavyweight title fight over the middleweight championship fight, which pretty interesting there. I'm not sure. Like the last time we saw this happen, it was because it was a heavyweight Grand Prix fight, I thought. Now maybe it's just because it's a heavyweight fight, or because Roy Nelson and Mirko Cro Cop are the bigger names, you know, as a couple. You know, a lot of people know Gegard Mousasi probably, but not necessarily Rafael Carvalho, and everybody knows Roy Nelson and Mirko Cro Cop. So, you know, so with that being said, let's break down this fight, give you my prediction. As you can see, I'm going with Roy Nelson. Roy Nelson is 23-15 as a pro. Mirko Cro Cop is 36-11. Mirko Cro Cop's record's a little better, but he hasn't necessarily been fighting the same level of competition as Roy Nelson. And this is actually a rematch. Roy Nelson won the first fight via TKO in the 3rd round. It was at a time when Mirko Cro Cop was coming off of a 2-fight losing streak at that point to Frank Mir and also Brendan Schaub. Since then, though, since losing those 3 fights in the UFC, and the most recently to Roy Nelson, he won 8 fights outside of the UFC. And so, but it was not in Bellator or whatever. Mirko Cro Cop was fighting like in Rizin. So he was winning some fights over there in Rizin, but he wasn't fighting the same level of competition of guys as Roy Nelson, who remained in the UFC fighting the best heavyweights in the world before coming to Bellator. And then Roy Nelson had a successful Bellator debut against Javi Ayala, and then he also almost beat Matt Mitrione to advance into the semifinals of the Bellator Heavyweight Grand Prix. He had Matt Mitrione in that crucifix punching him in the face. The ref low-key could have stopped the fight. It was a great position for Roy Nelson. He ended up losing a majority decision, but he almost won that fight versus Matt Mitrione. He could be 2-0 still in the heavyweight title tournament right now if he won that fight. So I'm taking Roy Nelson to win the fight. He's looked good in his last 2 fights. Also, he's been fighting higher level competition and a little more active as of late. Both of these guys are over 40, I believe. Roy Nelson is 41, Mirko Cro Cop is 43, so it's pretty even. It's not like you got some young stud taking on some 43-year-old guy. Both of them are veterans of the game, veterans of the sport, but I'm picking Roy Nelson to get the W. With that being said, it is what it is. This was the Bellator 200 breakdown and my predictions. Let the full-time family know who you got in the comments. I'm out. And as always, thanks for watching this video. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you hit the subscribe button and also hit the notification bell right next to it so you're notified every time I upload a video. I'm out.
Da 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 da. It's the motherfucking DOWG.